Welcome, I'm Dr. Adam Ingrayo. Today's video is on purchasing bees. And this is probably something all of you are very excited about, especially if you've never had bees before, is this idea of actually getting your first beehives. But the reason why I wanted to make this video is mainly because, well, there's a lot of questions that I get over the years and every year for that matter from folks that are starting to get into the industry that are related to their first purchase of honeybees. And these are the questions that we're going to cover kind of in depth here today in this short video. We're going to talk about where do I find my bees? So where do you actually purchase bees from? What do I purchase and why? And so what is the reasoning behind what you're purchasing? And we'll talk about the difference between packages and nukes and why you might want to purchase one over the other, depending on your scenario that you're in. We'll also talk about how many hives do I want or / need, and those can be two very different things between what you actually need and what maybe you think you want as a new beekeeper. And so we'll talk about that as well. How much equipment do I need? And I'll tell you exactly how much equipment you're going to need for the regular Langstroth hives, as far as what do you need when you purchase new bees and how much equipment you're going to need to get you through a season. And then finally, we'll talk about timing your purchases and weather, because weather plays a big factor into what you purchase depending on where you live in the country. So that's going to make a big difference. So let's talk about these things. So first thing we're going to talk about is where do you find bees from? So you're looking to purchase your first bees, and the place where you're generally going to find bees is at places like your local bee clubs. This is a really important part about being part of the beekeeping industry is the club format that we have across the country. In general, states have local clubs, and then they will have a state level beekeeping club. And those are the places where you're generally going to find most of your bees. Now, you can find them also from just individual beekeepers, and that's the case with a lot of nukes, is that you tend to find those from local beekeepers, whereas with clubs, larger clubs or suppliers that you can buy bees from in general, those are going to be packages. Now, some suppliers, even like Man Lake or Better Bee, do sell nukes, but those are in-state purchases. Those are things that you have to go and pick up. You don't ship nukes. And so packages tend to be a way that a lot of clubs get these bees because they're raised and bred in California or the South. Generally, Georgia is a hotbed for a lot of package production. So they're developed and packaged in those states, but packages can be shipped. So they can be shipped even via U.S. Postal Service. They can be shipped. And so that is where you're going to get like your online sales. So if you're purchasing bees online and they're being shipped to you, those are always going to be packages. Nukes will be something that you are going to have to go pick up because they are not available to be shipped. So that's the big difference. But in general, you're going to find these from clubs, local beekeepers, or even from suppliers, like I mentioned a couple, that you can actually purchase bees from and have them shipped to you via package. So something to keep in mind. But most of the time when you're dealing with packages, they go through a middleman. Now, a lot of times, unless you live in the area where they're being produced, you don't really have the availability to just go and pick up a bunch of packages from the supplier themselves. Most of the time, it's a middleman that is picking up the packages, purchasing them, and then bringing them to a secondary place where they're sold to the beekeeping community. Next question is what to buy. And this is something really that you have to think of depending on where you're at in the country. So we'll start with packages. Now, packages generally, depending on where you live, they're going to vary greatly. So if you live in the area where they're produced, you can get packages still for under $100. If you live, the further away you live from where packages are produced, the more expensive they get. So I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, one of the furthest places you can get away from package producers. And generally packages range anywhere from I'd say $120 to maybe $160, $170 a piece here where I live. Whereas, like I said earlier, if you live in the area where they're produced, you can a lot of times get packages for under $100 a piece. The reason that you pay more the further north you go is because of the middleman. You have someone that has gone down, picked up those packages from wherever the supplier is, and then made the transit all the way to wherever they're going to distribute them to their customers. So that's generally how that happens. Packages are sold through clubs and suppliers. Generally, there's two ways that you can buy packages. 3-pound packages are the pretty standard and are becoming more and more standard. You can still find 2-pound packages, but 3-pound packages are pretty much what you're going to find overall. What that means is that you basically have a box like you see pictured here that's full of 3 pounds of bees, and they literally just put the box on a scale, have a big funnel, and they just shake bees into these boxes. What you can think of this is like, it's like a swarm of bees, basically, is what you can think about this kind of a package as. It's a bunch of bees with a queen. Now, the queen is going to be in a cage in the package, and so you're going to have the bees, a caged queen, and then you're going to have a feeder as well, which is generally a coffee can looking thing that sits in there and the bees feed from. It's got a sugar syrup solution in it, which keeps the bees alive during transit. Now, they're always going to be produced in the South or out West. And here in Michigan, where I live, generally we don't start to see them available until April. Now, depending on where you're at, that can be very different. Packages a lot of times can be available in February and March if you're in an area that's a climate you start keeping bees during that time. For me, where I live, that's kind of like April or early May for us, meaning that that's when we actually start working bees, when the temperatures, the snow's gone enough and the temperatures are high enough to actually work bees. So this varies greatly depending on where you live. So the reason I bring up timing in that sense is that the big drawback with packages is that they are vulnerable to cold, meaning that if you install a package on brand new equipment, which is what most new beekeepers have. Meaning brand new equipment, what I mean is the foundation is not drawn. You don't have drawn combs. When you install a package on brand new equipment and it is cold, the package actually can die on that equipment just because of temperature. Bees cannot thermal regulate on foundation. They have to have drawn combs in order to be able to cluster and thermal regulate appropriately. So for folks that live in northern climates where you may see packages available to you in, say here, if I'm using Michigan as an example, I may have packages that someone's willing to sell me in March. But if I have freezing temperatures all the way through the month of March, the moment I put those bees into that new equipment and they try to cluster, all they're going to do is freeze to death. And so oftentimes when you're buying packages, you have to be absolutely certain that you are out of freezing and cold temperatures in general. Bees start clustering around 60 degrees, 65 degrees. So it needs to be relatively warm before you install these packages. So depending on where you are, that is a huge thing to keep in mind about packages, is the vulnerability to cold. Now, the other side of that is that packages are super easy to find. You can buy packages pretty much any time during the beekeeping season and have them available to you. They can be shipped to you, so they're very, very convenient in that manner. But again, if you're in a northern climate, they can be kind of tricky if you're a brand new beekeeper. Now, if you have drawn combs and honey frames or things like that, you can install a package on old equipment just fine during vulnerable times of cold. But if you don't have drawn foundation is the key. So actual combs, you will not be able to thermoregulate without that in a package situation. Let's talk about nukes. Now, depending on where you're at, this is going to be highly variable as well. Again, the more south and west you go, the cheaper these things tend to get. With nukes, depending on where you're at, the price range is going to be somewhere probably between $150 and maybe $250, depending on where you're at and what the market's like. Nukes are always locally produced, and this is the best way to create a sustainable beekeeping community, is by purchasing local nukes. Packages, you are importing material, even though it's minimal material. You're still importing pests with those types of bees, even though it may be minimal, but you are moving things around. Local bees produced in a local community is the way that we stop the movement of pests and pathogens and bees all around the country. So I'm a big advocate of locally produced nukes. Now, the thing is that they're locally produced, meaning there has to be a beekeeper in your area that is at scale and has the capacity to actually create these and create a market and sell them. The big thing with nukes, is you're going to notice that depending on where you're at, many nuke producers have started producing medium nukes and deep nukes, meaning that nukes are sold on medium frames or deep frames. Now, depending on what your equipment you have, the bees don't care if you're using all medium equipment or all deep equipment or a hodgepodge of the two. You just need to know what equipment you're going to be installing your bees into when you make these purchases. So that's something to be aware of, is that both are sold. You don't have that issue with packages. They're only sold 2 or 3 pound packages. Those are the ways you're going to buy those. The frames can actually be different depending on what you purchase. And in general, deep frame nukes are going to be more expensive than medium frame nukes. Medium frame nukes are going to go in 6 5/8 inch equipment, tall equipment. We call those medium boxes or medium hive bodies, and deep frames are clearly going to go into deep hive bodies. The way that nukes are typically produced is that this is a fully functioning bee colony. You're going to have 5 full frames in these nukes. You're going to have drawn comb on all of those, laying queen, you're going to have brood and food, and that's what should be expected in a quality nuke. Now, one thing to keep in mind about nukes is that depending on who you're purchasing from, if it's someone that's new or just starting to sell nukes, always make sure that you're getting what you paid for, because I have had nightmare stories, and we are the largest producer of nukes in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, my business. We have had nightmare stories from customers about nukes that they've purchased from other people that literally have like 2 frames of bees in them. That picture that you see on the left there of that series of pictures, this one right here, that is about what your nuke should look like when you purchase it. As far as the number of bees, it should be completely covered in bees. It should not be ready to swarm. It should be a full box of bees and resources. And that's what you should expect. But that's what a nuke is going to look like. Now, depending on where you're at, the availability is going to be different on these than packages, because packages are produced a lot of times out of the region, whereas these are produced locally. So you have to wait for the weather to get better. So I have an example here, sold May through June. That is for us here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We sell our nukes May through June because by that time we've had an opportunity to reverse our colonies. We've had spring buildup, and then we've split them down and then allowed them to grow out in these nukes. So it just depends on where you're at, and what the availability is going to be is going to depend on the seasonality, meaning how quickly your beekeepers who are supplying nukes can get into their colonies and start working them. What the nukes do, though, even though you likely are going to get these later than you would a package if you were to purchase packages, is that they give you about a 4-week head start, because you have a fully functioning colony here. It's not like the bees have to draw comb, and by the time they draw comb, then the queen starts laying, and then you get this ramp up of brood production. No, this is already a colony that's rocking and rolling. You put this into a hive body with other frames, and this is going to they're going to start drawing out those frames immediately. So you get a lot of head start with a nuke. All right, what to buy? So packages versus nukes are a kind of something that you have to really understand, and really understand from the perspective of what is best for my region. And I had mentioned this whole idea of clustering on drawn comb, and I told you that that's important for where I live. So like northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, if you live anywhere, even close on the same latitudes as me, or somewhere that gets real winter, like sustained winter for months and months and months, these are really important, because that clustering factor on drawn comb that package bees cannot do, because a lot of times you're putting them on fresh material, meaning, foundation that's undrawn. Again, you can have a big problem with bees freezing in place in those types of situations. The other thing to keep in mind here when you are looking at packages versus nukes is spring buildup. Again, I just mentioned that you're already starting from a 5-frame, fully functioning colony that has brood on, has a life cycle happening, broods being turned over every 21 days. This is already fully functioning. So for spring buildup, your nukes are going to build a lot faster than your packages. Most of the time with packages, you're going to spend the entire year getting those bees to get to where they need to be. They'll get through the winter, and then really you're going to start rocking and rolling the second year. Whereas with the nukes, you oftentimes are rocking and rolling that first year, meaning that you're producing honey, maybe even excess honey to harvest. Whereas with packages, you're really focused on that first year of drawing comb and getting enough resources to get you through the first winter. Availability is always going to be something to think about when you're thinking about packages and nukes. packages are always going to be more available than nukes. And for example, like I mentioned earlier, we're one of the largest nuke producers here in the state of Michigan and the largest in the Upper Peninsula. There is huge demand because we are in an area where there's not a lot of nuke producers. There's huge demand for our products. So, for example, last year we sold out of 150 nukes in 5 days. So the demand can be very, very high for nukes, especially nukes that are well made. Customers, word spreads fast and demand gets really high for these producers who produce a quality product. So you need to be sure that you have them available to you. And the key here is that nuke sales for a lot of people start in December and January. If you're in areas where nukes are being delivered in like February or March, you're likely going to have to order those sometime in the winter, like November or December, but several months ahead of time. So what you need to do is identify the producer you want to purchase from and then get in contact with them and kind of see what their operation is when it comes to nuke sales. Some will have waiting lists that you can get on. Others, like myself, we don't do waiting lists. Everything is first come, first serve. We tell people when we're going to post them for sale, and when they're gone, they're gone. So, it just depends on who you're working with. But make sure you have an understanding of that, because you're going to want to get a head start on the nuke purchase if you want to go that route. Packages, same, can be the same way, but like I said, they're widely available for most of the season, especially because you can order them online. 50% down is very common for bee purchases, especially nuke purchases. We, in my business, require 50% down, meaning you're going to put a 50% deposit on to hold that nuke. Also, keep in mind that the thing here you're dealing with is livestock, right? These are living organisms. It's not like you're going to be able to purchase this, bring it home, and then return it at a later date. That's not how this works. When you purchase these animals, once they are in your hands, they are your property. There is no way for the producer to know if you have screwed up or not. And I've had many situations over the last decade of selling bees where customers have done things that we knew they had done to damage the colony. So things like not being responsible when you're moving these from where you purchased them to your home. We've had people that have gotten in car accidents and had colonies that have actually been opened up, and then want to know what they can do to for us to fix that. We don't fix that. We provide you a quality product. When you leave the property, that is yours, because that is a living organism. So please be very aware of that. But you're going to want to order, always you're going to want to order early to make sure you're getting your nukes. Packages, again, much more available. All right, so how many hives do you want to start? And this is a question I get a lot. People get very, very ambitious when it comes to bees. I'm going to start with 10 colonies. Somebody a few years back told me that they were going to start with 100 colonies. And I literally told them, well, you're going to just waste all of that money. The reason is because beekeeping is not like other things. Most of us, when we grow up, we have animals like birds or four-legged vertebrates like dogs or cats. These are things that we're very familiar with. We understand their life cycles, even though if it's very, very, loose understanding, there's at least a form of understanding because of exposure to those organisms over time. Most of us are not exposed to insects over our adolescence and young adulthood. That's not something, other than maybe just a biology class in high school that mentions insects and life cycles or something like that. Most of us get very little exposure to that. Most of the folks who are experts in this area, like myself, are entomologists who have literally spent, decades studying insects. And so there's a really ease of understanding when it comes to these things. So what I'm saying in this context is that because there is such a steep learning curve to beekeeping, please do not start with a bunch of beehives. We are not supposed to be in the business of killing bees. And that's what happens when people get really ambitious, especially with their thinking of their abilities without ever laying hands on a beehive. You need to be really conscious about what you're doing. You would not go out and buy 100 head of cattle without any understanding of how to work with cattle. Don't do the same thing with honeybees. These are living organisms that deserve our respect and deserve our attention, and making sure that we are being responsible with their lives, because we play a very important role in the lives of honeybees. So how many hives do you want to start with? You want to start with 2 to 3. You don't want to start with less than two, so don't start with one hive because you're going to use oftentimes one hive to support another hive. You may lose a queen in your first year of beekeeping, very common because of a lot of times mishandling of bees. But if you have something that goes wrong with one colony, you can always use the second one to support it. And that's a really important thing that we do in beekeeping is this idea of being able to support colonies with other colonies. That's why we have 2 to 3 to start. You don't want more than 3 because that learning curve is steep and you will be way in over your head if you get more than 3 colonies to really get going. So that is always the best place to start, is a couple colonies to get going. No more, no less. Next year, think of it this way. Next year, when these 3 colonies survive, you're going to be able to split those and get, 6 or 9 more colonies out of that. Conversely, you buy 10 this year, you're completely overwhelmed, you lose all 10 of them, you start from scratch the next year. So make sure you understand those things and always think about the life of the bees. The hives can support one another, like I'd mentioned. Queens, you can take brood from one colony and give it to another in order to support development. Maybe you have a colony that's lagging behind and just not getting going. Well, you can take a bunch of brood from a banger colony and put it in a small colony to help that colony balance out. You can also take food from a big colony to support a small colony. So it's a really important thing to be able to have a couple of those. It's also important to see the differences between good colonies and bad colonies. Invariably, you're always going to have a colony that's going to have a little something going on. Maybe it's struggling. Maybe something happened. Maybe you had a queen event. All of these things can happen in beekeeping. These are natural biological organisms. Lots of things happen, but it's important to see the differences between colonies because it gives you a frame of reference to be able to work from and learn from. For 2 hives, plan on spending about $1,000. All the equipment, protective equipment included, you're going to spend about $1,000 on those, on that total setup. As far as equipment that you're going to need to get started, now we're only going to talk about Langstroth colonies here. This can, you can obviously buy bees for many different colonies. If you are buying bees for any other colony that does not use Langstroth frames, you are likely not going to be able to purchase nukes. So if you're using a top bar colony, if you're using a Layens colony, if you're using any number of alternative hives, Ware colonies, any number of those alternative hives that don't use standard Langstroth frames, you are likely not going to be able to find nukes, and packages are going to be your only option. So just keep that in mind. For equipment, though, when it comes to Langstroth colonies, what you're going to want, you're going to do either 10 or 8 frame equipment. If you're dealing with any kind of lifting restrictions, 8 frame is definitely the way to go. You're going to determine what kind of hive bodies you want to use. So you're either going to use deep or medium hive bodies, and that's what you're going to purchase the nuke to correspond with that. The classic arrangement, and this is all the equipment you're going to need for your entire first season if you're going with the standard Langstroth. If you're doing the classic arrangement, you're going to want to buy 2 deeps and 3 mediums. And even in a good honey flow, that's going to get you through your first year for one hive. So if you're buying 2 hives, you're going to purchase that, 4 deeps and 6 mediums. If you are using all mediums, meaning that you don't use deep hive bodies at all, which I am a big proponent of, even for people who are able-bodied, none of us are getting any younger, and reducing the weight of these hive bodies can dramatically increase or decrease your risk of secondary injury when working bees. Back injuries are very common in our industry. So if you're using all mediums, 6 mediums is what you're going to need to get you through that first season. New equipment is always best. Buying used equipment, you run a big risk of bringing in pathogens into your apiary. The big one is American foul brood, because we know American foul brood spores stay active within woodenware for about 80 years. So new equipment is always the best thing to buy. Used, you don't know if it's pathogen free or not. So just keep that in mind. Timing. So early packages are really risky in northern cold climate. So if you live in colder climates and you have, winter that lasts into, say, March or April, getting bees delivered during March or April is super risky, especially if it's on new equipment. So if you live in northern regions where you have real winter, you want to make sure you're out of that winter cycle before you install bees, especially package bees. So For example, get it as late as possible. Generally, the last shipments that go out of package producers, like some of the last mass production shipments, are usually the last week in April, first couple weeks in May, depending on the season. So that's about the cutoff date when they'll stop producing them. If you live in far northern climates, you want to get that as late as possible. If you live in a temperate climate, you can buy bees anytime. I'm originally from Southern California. We kept bees 12 months out of the year. So, I mean, it just depends on where you live. And that's something that you should all understand is all beekeeping is local. So that's why those local connections, purchasing bees from local folks is really important, because they're the ones that are going to be able to tell you what's best for your region, and likely have selected bees that are well bred for your area as well. Nukes are going to be available later, depending on where you're at. That could be as late as May to June, but can be earlier in other areas of the United States where, you get, where you don't have winter, or spring is a real season for you and not just a couple weeks like it is for me. So that's something to keep in mind, is that those will always be available depending on where your location is. Could be earlier or not really later than June. You don't really see nukes available after June. So that's really something to keep in mind, because also those nukes are going to be the first ones to sell out. So, you always want to make sure when it comes to purchasing bees that you're planning ahead and making sure that you understand, one, where you're going to be getting them from. The other one is, make sure you're buying from a reputable supplier, someone who is, just starting to sell nukes. A lot of times you'll see on Facebook, I have 5 nukes available. That's somebody that's at a very small scale for the most part. And you want to ask the right questions when you're doing this. So I'll leave you with just this. When you're dealing with bees, the things that you want to ask for, especially when it comes to nukes, is, are you getting an overwintered queen, or are you getting a fresh queen? Some people will sell overwintered queens, and some customers like that. Some people want fresh queens, meaning that it's a queen that was bred that year. So those are something to keep in mind when it comes to nukes, is what type of queen are you getting? When it comes to packages, you're always getting brand new queens. But that is one question that I always try to tell people to ask about when they purchase nukes is it an overwintered queen or is it a fresh queen? Now, the difference between the two, and I'll leave you with this, is that bees, we know queens generally are most productive for about 18 to 24 months. So take that in mind when you're purchasing an overwintered queen, is that it's a queen that has a full season on it at that point. So just things to keep in mind. But I hope this video showed you and gave you some information on how to best kind of set yourself up for success when it comes to purchasing bees, and what are the things that you should know as an individual purchasing bees. Thanks for joining me today. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.